Well, welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode number 432, being recorded on the 28th of July, 2022. Today, we have Cale and myself who are going to talk about an interesting service in Azure, which I think hasn't gotten a lot of coverage. But before that, let's see if Cale has anything in terms of news. Cale?
Yeah, I got a few things here. So one of them is around AI. We've talked a lot about different ML and AI services in Azure on the podcast before, and there's some more nice little blog posts written up here about some integration with the Deep Speed team. So as you know, as I mentioned, there's a few different kind of services and offerings that help folks who are developing in the AI space and machine learning space on Azure. Leveraging, obviously the hardware components such as our GPUs and FPGAs and things like that. But this is also when you start building stuff like that, obviously you need these training pipelines and training models and things like that you need. And Deep Speed is a group who has a lot of that stuff. And so there's some integration there now to basically provide very simple to use training pipelines for Azure ML and things like that to get started with your different kind of AI workloads that are up there. So basically, and it also increases some of the speed around what they're doing in this space, what Deep Speed has been working on in this space. So the link to the blog post, it gets into some of the technical details around the speed gains and things like that of these different models and how these things are much faster. And also a link to the Deep Speed site that has a lot of these kind of models and things up there that you can peruse and integrate it into Azure. The second one is around cost details. I bring this up from time to time because it's always on our blog about, especially for enterprise customers, there's now it's generally available, the cost details API, and this is for EA and MCA customers. So this provides kind of granular level cost details to what's going on in not just Azure, but also Microsoft 365, Dynamics, Power Platform, those things. So all of those kind of envelop together and basically give you a way to kind of view these granular cost details as well as export them. All kinds of cool stuff there that you probably large enterprises want to integrate in to maybe get a sense for where they're spending their money in the Microsoft Cloud. And the last one I had was...
Sorry, Kate, I just wanted to clarify for our listeners. EA is Enterprise Agreement Customer, right? These are typically big customers. And MCA is Microsoft Customer Agreement Customers, which I believe are small and medium business. Is that how it is? I forget how the distinction is. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that acronyms again.
I had to look it up myself. I forgot what they meant.
Yeah. And then the last one, we kind of missed this back in the Inspire stuff. We just had a conference just recently. And one of the announcements was close to home to me was talking about ACL. I don't know that we've deep dived on this on a podcast. Maybe we should in the future. ACL stands for Azure Confidential Ledger. So we have a technology called another acronym, CCF, which is Confidential Consortium Framework. Think of it like a digital ledger that uses enclave technology, like SGX processors that we have. So if you're familiar with our Azure Confidential Computing nodes, those have SGX processors in them. And these are used to basically safeguard the transactions, the execution of code that's happening in these things. And what's happening with ACL is it allows you to basically use that service to tag in and get access to those a ledger behind that. So that went GA in Inspire time. So that's a pretty big milestone for that group. I wanted to mention that one as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you missed that one before, Cale. That's right down your alley.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for those updates. So let's get to our discussion item today, which is a service called the app config service in Azure. I don't think it's too much of a secret as to what app config service does, but let me explain a little bit about the rationale for it and how we can best leverage it. I'll be honest with you, as a developer, I'm just surprised I didn't find this service earlier. If you're a developer on the cloud, for sure you need to look into the service. And so let's just see what it has to offer. So as you know, when we write apps, Cale, there's always some sort of configuration you have to provide to it, right? I think as part of the best practices, you want to externalize everything from your application as much as possible so that it can be controlled, configured externally. Of course, in traditionally, if you look at a simple app service, like a web app or something of that nature, we've always had the feature where you could go to the portal and set some configuration for your application. You can do that with functions. You can do that with a number of services that Azure offers. And when you set those values, they're typically permeated to the application, sometimes in the form of environment variables, and sometimes through a configuration file of sort. But the application code can read those configuration values at all times. And that's great. That's the way that you want to do it, right? Of course, if you have something that's sensitive in nature, you don't want to do it that way. You want to store it into something like Key Vault and then somehow tie in the configuration to Key Vault. Again, those are all normal best practices which we've all been doing. The problem is that if you're even a small or a medium company, and definitely if you're a large company, you're going to have a lot of applications out there, right? And all those applications typically will share the same similar types of configuration. If you use the technique that we just talked about, each and every app now has to have those settings configured, right? Each and every application in the cloud. And of course, you have to make sure that they're all consistent, they're all pointing to the same value, that they're secure, there's no secrets being leaked, so on and so forth. So that can get pretty complex if you have even a small number of applications, not to mention large ones. And then further, if you're a big enterprise, just being able to understand at one place, what are my all my configuration values, right? What sort of config values do my apps have? If I make a change to a database, how many applications do I need to go and inform about this change in database? Or if I had to change a connection string of some sort. So these are all problems that we have all dealt with as an application developers over the years. And now we have something like the app config service, which helps to solve these problems. So what app config service is? It's a service hosted in Azure. It uses the very simple connection string, or maybe you can even use manage identity to connect to it. But essentially, your configuration is stored in Azure in a secure place. Okay. Now, configuration is always thought of as two types: sensitive and non-sensitive. So you would say that the non-sensitive parts, you can just go to the app config service and you can just add them there, right? There's a little editor, and it's something called the configuration explorer. You go in there and add those values. Sounds good. What happens if you have sensitive items like passwords and connection strings? Those you can still put in app config, but app config is pointed to a key vault on the back end, right? So it's like a pass through to get to key vault. From your perspective, you're still talking to app config, but app config will then delegate some of those more sensitive items to a key vault on the back. So this way, we're kind of getting the best of both worlds, right? We're getting the convenience of having everything in one place, yet the security of getting the sensitive items from something like key vault. So that is like, at its very crux, that is what the app config service offers us. Now, the question is obvious, is like, hey, I'm an application developer. How do I reference those app config values, right? Obviously, we have to have a way to connect to them. And so what Microsoft has done along with the services, they have made available a large number of SDKs for various programming languages to make it easy to integrate the app config service in your application. Most applications, let's say .NET Core, I'm picking on that because I'm familiar with it, but I think Java Spring Boot and others also have similar easy to use features. It uses the existing configuration system that those frameworks provide and extends them to be able to connect to app config service. So for example, in .NET Core, we have the usual configuration object where we can go in and read settings from our config files today. By just adding some using statements and attaching a service in the startup of the application, it automatically will talk to your app config service now to get those same configuration values, right? The application can still remain the same. I need config blah. It's going to get blah from from your app config service. If blah happens to be a sensitive item, it's going to further reach out to the key vault to get it. So again, this is kind of nicely abstracted away from from you. Yep.
Yeah, a couple questions there. So one is if I can use, and I did a little looking into this myself too, if I could use Key Vault secrets to store stuff, let's say it's not even like super sensitive, but pretty much anything I put in my configuration, I'm a little bit paranoid about. Like I don't want to leak some of it. It might not all be passwords, but it could be other stuff that's relatively sensitive. Why wouldn't I just use Key Vault to do it? Is there like a limitation? Like when I store stuff in this, can I store like different data structures as opposed to like a simple string that I store in Key Vault? Like what's the benefit, I guess?
That's a good question. And at least from, the types of information you can store in there, it's very similar to what you can store in app config, right? It's basically just string. You can provide some content type information if you want to, but they could be strings. I think 10K or whatever is the max size typically. But like I said, when you're dealing with even a medium or a large number of configuration items, there are other features that you need, which Key Vault does not offer. Two of them, or I would say three of them specifically, I will call out. One is there is no way to easily create a hierarchy of configuration items like most companies need, right? So if you think about a hierarchy might look like something like, hey, my application name, colon, the settings, colon, the connection string, right? So that's a typical hierarchy. Another application would have a, application B, settings, connection string. So now that's obviously part of application B and not application A. So this way, we're not having any name conflicts or anything like that. I'm sure you've seen in Key Vault that often happens, where you can have two people can create the same name for the same secret. I mean, of course, you could use the comma or some kind of separator in Key Vault as well. So to some extent, you can achieve this in Key Vault. But there's another feature that the app config service offers called labels. And so what you could easily do is assign labels to each of your configuration items. Let's say a label could be development, a label could be QA, and a label could be production. And now you have these three sets of configuration out there with different labels. And if I'm an app coming up, all I have to say is, hey, I want I want to read all my configuration for QA because I'm currently in QA or in the QA system. And it will then get all the QA values. Now, there's no easy way to do that in Key Vault, as it stands today. Yes, you can stand up multiple Key Vaults, just like you can stand up multiple app config services, and point to it in from your application running in each of the environments. But there's no way to kind of group them all into one. And some of the advantages of grouping into one is just so that you have a collective view of all of your configuration items. It's a nice thing to have everything in one. Does that help, Cale?
Yeah, yeah. The other question I had was around Key Vault itself. You mentioned like this kind of like pass through or something like it's going through there. Can you talk through like what's that look like when I set up my configuration value? Do I like label it or something and tell it like, or at that point, do I tell it which key vault to use? Like, how do I set that up? Or is it something like I have to go out of band and create a key vault and then come back to this thing and do something? Like,
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think what the product team has done is they have built a generic interface where they can provide a pass-through for certain items in app config. Okay, and they've written a few implementations of those pass-throughs. I believe one of them is the Key Vault pass-through for sensitive items. Another one, which I don't know if it's released yet, but they are working on a file system pass-through. So if let's say if you're going to read a configuration that's more than 10K, and like I mentioned, that's the limit today of what you can store in app config service. But you can then say, I want to pass through this to get it from a blob storage, right? Or something like that. So now you can get maybe it's a certificate file that's large or something like that, and you have to read it in. So that's so there's this generic interface that they have provided to get information from the back, and one of them happens to be the Key Vault reference that you can provide. So it's kind of up to you when you're creating these config items to make a decision at that point whether you want to use one of the referenced data stores or use the data store that's available in config service. Now, from a security perspective, everything's encrypted in config service as it is, right? Obviously, not the same level of encryption like we're familiar with Key Vault with HSNs and all that, but it is encrypted at rest. So there's a certain amount of security you get even out of the box with the base app config service.
so the big question is, do I got to pay for this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So then the great answer for us developers is that there is a free tier. right? And the free tier has, I think the only limitation of the free tier is that in each subscription you're allowed only one instance. It's great if if you want to test it out, or even if you just want, if one is, as I said, you could use just one instance of app config service for all of your keys, right? Because you can use hierarchies and labels and whatnot, and kind of organize them in the best way, in the best way you can. And I think the limit is that you can only make 1,000 requests per day in the free tier, whereas the standard tier, which is the next tier up, which costs some money, that is 30,000 requests per day is the cap on that one. And obviously, there are a few more feature advantages there. You can have any number of app config stores in the standard tier. You're not limited to just one per subscription. You can have multiple per subscription if you want to. So if you're a startup and you just want to use it free. There should be no reason why you shouldn't want to use the service as an app developer. That's really how they are positioning the app config service.
What about like if I start putting, these are kind of important, right? Like configuration elements for my app. How does it, do I have to like turn on HA? Like, how do I know for sure that they're going to be there tomorrow? Like, is there any kind of like model for that, like as part of this? Because that would be important.
Yeah, so they have one of the things that they built in for free, they give it to you in the service is they have the redundancy within the local data center, 3 data centers within a region, right? So it's a regional service. That's, I guess, to answer your question, it's a regional service. So when you provision it, you provision it per region, and then you have your failover within the various zones, within the region. So that is out of the box. So you get one level of redundancy right there. In terms of loss of data, that is not that is again the data will never get lost. It's more a question of access of the data, right? When will you not have access to the data? So one of the nice things about config service is that you're not supposed to be using it like 100 times a second, right? Configuration by nature is you start up, your applications read the configuration, you specify a cache interval for how long you want to cache those configuration values, and then you use it, right? The application will just use it. Now, what you can do in your app is you can configure how frequently you want to refresh those values. That's the nice thing that the app configuration service allows is you can change the values dynamically if you want to. And when they are changed, there's a couple of ways that applications can get notified about the change. Okay, one is just by them polling regularly as per this cache interval, they can be polling for it. That's the pull method. The other one, you can set up a more advanced push method. You can configure it to connect to Event Grid and push a notification down to your application to say, hey, this thing changed, the certificate has expired or whatever, a new one has been issued, you need to recycle or reload. And so you could do that as well. So there's multiple ways that you can have the cache refresh. And tying it back to what you were asking about earlier is being that it's a regional service, if there is obviously an outage within the region, you can configure the app service in a secondary region. So you can take that. That's something that you'd have to do in your application if you feel it's so sensitive that you have to have access to your thing at all time, right? Your application's your configuration. You can configure a secondary region to get your application configured.
Yeah, I also saw the other thing that's like comes up a lot, especially when we're building these, where we got a bunch of services that we're connecting, is like whether that service is public or private, like what's the exposure there. And I saw like app config service actually supports where you can basically disable public access. So that's awesome too. It sounds like, because that would be super important to like
I
highly
agree.
sensitive companies.
Yeah, and if all your apps are in the cloud, why do you even want it out in the open, right? I mean, everything's in the cloud. You just get to it locally through the Azure backbone. And another nice feature, I'm sorry, was there a question there, Cale?
No, go ahead.
So one feature that I really love about App Config Service is feature flags, right? I'm sure, in your work, you use a lot of feature flags to control which bits of your application are currently to be activated, right? Depending on how the release is going, on what new bits and features, or who has opted into certain releases, features. So management of feature flags is a big part of app config service. And in fact, you go to the portal and there's a complete whole section for feature manager there, right? And so you define your feature flags. You can define, some description for them. You can give them labels. And things like that, right? And now from your application, like I take a simple .NET application, and obviously there's the appropriate namespaces and classes you will import to use it, but it's really a matter of just annotating a particular method to say, okay, this method is only active if this feature is active, right? If this feature flag is present. And so when your application starts up, you simply load all the feature flags in, and it will immediately configure your application to block out certain APIs or even a web page, right? You can annotate certain parts of the web page to only be active if a certain feature flag is present. So that just by doing a little bit of ampersand whatever markup on the web page, it will basically block out or show certain parts of the web page. And I think that's a feature to use a pun, that's a feature that's always been available, even in the .NET Core base library. You would have to use a file, like a feature file, to provide that. They've just extended that now to use the app config service, and then you have that nice portal experience where you can go and manage all your feature flags that are available for your applications.
That's pretty cool. I didn't know about that. That's neat.
Yeah. And then one more thing I want to get in, Cale, before we wrap up over here is, a big thing is if you are moving from, let's say, some other configuration system into app config service, you might have the need to import all of your configuration in. And there is a, import feature available both in the portal, in the Azure CLI, and also there's some GitHub actions that are available to help you import, automatically import configuration into app config service as part of your rollout to this new service. And try, let's see, did I forget something? Yeah, the authentication, like I said, use connection strings, but they recommend you use managed identity is the most preferred way, as it is with most things, to access the app config service.
And I don't know if you mentioned it, because also I wasn't like super aware of the service either. Is this something that's like in GA form right now? Is this preview? Like, what's the state of this right now?
As far as I'm aware, this is GA. It has been GA for a while. They are
I
constantly
feel
updating.
bad if we didn't talk about it.
I know. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I only found out by mistake, not by mistake, but somebody was working with a customer and they told me about it. Like, oh, we use the app config service. Like, what app config service is this? I felt a bit foolish, actually. But yeah. So that's the app config service for you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all this, Sujit. I'm sure this is again, I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't know about, so it's great for us to talk about it so that it gets more exposure. So thanks again for detailing this.
You're welcome. Take care.